Hello, everyone. Welcome to this EA Zoom meeting. It's totally an honor and a pleasure to be here with you today. Today, I'll be talking about the Saturn transit conjunct your natal sun. I am, for those of you who don't know me, I'm pretty new around here. My name is Kimberly. I'm known as Kimberly Stargazer, the Empress of EclipseTarot.com. I've been reading the tarot for over 20 years. I study energy work and healing, and I'm passionate about learning all things evolutionary astrology. So the reason why I chose to present on this topic today is because currently Saturn is conjunct my natal sun. Like a cosmic Valentine, Saturn arrived at 26 degrees where my Capricorn sun is on February 14th. And 29 years ago, just shy of my 14th birthday, I experienced my first Saturn sun transit. It was a monumental year in my life that really, it's a time when I really developed convictions, and it reshaped the way I live my life. And reflecting back on that initial conjunction of, transit Saturn with my sun, helped me align more with who I am. And I've been doing a lot of reflection now that I'm upon this transit again in my life. And I do want to preface this just a little bit. I have an 8th house sun. So with Mercury and Mars and Capricorn in the 8th house as well. With Pluto there, my perception is a little bit deep and will color the way that I present. It, colors my perspective at this time with this transit. It's never just one transit. There are always other things going on. So I'm feeling more deeply into my sense of perception with Pluto's presence so close to the sun and Saturn now. So just bear with me. This is going to be an interesting thing, and I'm going to share with you more about all of this. So let's get the slides going. All right, so as a Capricorn, I like to give you a timeline and agenda. We are speaking Saturn today. So we're going to talk about the meaning of Saturn and the sun, archetypes individually. And I specialize in the Curly Thoth Tarot. So that is going to be how I present these archetypes. There's a lot of rich symbolism in those cards that really, I feel, really add depth to the archetypes. I like having the imagery. It helps me personally really interpret and integrate the meaning and the messages of those archetypes. We're going to talk about the meaning of the Saturn conjunct natal sun transit. I'm going to share with you an example transit chart of a 20th century icon, one who was nicknamed the Greatest. And he had a company and a book named GOAT, G-O-A-T, Greatest of All Time. So I'm going to share some of his, a couple of his Saturn Sun transits and what occurred during that time for him. And then I'm going to share, ends with a reflection of my first Saturn Sun transit that I experienced as an adolescent in my early teen years, and then real-time insights into this current Saturn Sun transit as I am now in my midlife. So it should be fun. So what we know of Saturn, I'm going to start here. Saturn as the ruler of Capricorn, there are so many things that go into what we know of Saturn astrologically, from an astronomy perspective. It really marks a boundary in our solar system, right? And it really creates, I like this image because it shows how compressed those rings are, right? Those rings that go around Saturn are they're so compressed that they're very like paper thin in comparison. And what Saturn, I'm feeling more and more, is that, you know, just like this image, just like the planet, how it behaves in space-time, right? It makes order out of chaos. And we're going to go a little bit deeper into that, but that's really prevalent and obvious with those rings, right? Because with the rings, that is a lot of space debris. And there's mystery in that as well, because astronomers don't exactly know exactly how the rings were formed, how long they will last. They're constantly puzzled and fascinated by the planet Saturn. So Saturn, for those of you who are into tarot or familiar with tarot, may know that Saturn is aligned with the universe card of the tarot. The universe card is also known as the world card in some other decks. But this is an image of the Crowley-Thoth deck that I use, the image of the universe. And this is representative of the planet Saturn. It's the number 21 card in the major arcana. And it's the last card, it's the final card in the tarot deck. So that is significant. In this image, there's a maiden at the center, right? The maiden is a dancing figure that manipulates the spiral force of nature, which is the active and the passive, the polarity and the duality of experience. Her dance partner is the sun. Directly looking into the eye of Horus, as you see in this image, she holds a sickle, but in my view, I think the way that the image is, it almost looks like a harp. Like this is a graceful, she looks very graceful. It doesn't look restricted as you would think of, you know, those words that we associate with Saturn, Saturn being known as more of a malefic planet, more of a negative side, the harsh, heavy realities of existence, right? This is a different perspective, which I really appreciate in this image. She's naked, so she's free from all the masks, all the unnecessary stuff, right? And she looks at the limitations of existence square in the eye as the mighty serpent graces her body. And you'll notice there on her foot that her foot is resting gently on the head of the serpent. And all of these symbols are very representative of what the planet Saturn represents, and is, you know, important to keep in mind when you're having a Saturn transit of any kind, right? But especially with one of the luminaries like the moon or the sun. So Aleister Crowley, the creator of this deck that I use, he said this about this card. He said, the hard facts of nature, but also the transcendence of space and time by a continuously self-compensating change. And I think that is an important distinction to make, is that it can be the reality of limitations, but also the transcendence. And that is what I really see encapsulated in this card. So it's the manifest, the established, the material world, but it's not just the world, right? It's not just Earth, it's the whole universe. It's the universe as a whole. It's everything that is. It's the completion of the great work. Celebration even of the great work being accomplished. So really let that sink in, because that is, especially right now in my life, I'm really feeling that, that completion. And that kind of completion taps us into a cosmic union, right? That liberation, this burning off of karma, the original oneness, the beginning and the end. Those are some words that Gerd Ziegler, in his book, Tarot, Mirror of the Soul, has used to describe this card. It's also an identification of the equilibrium between change and stability. So it's all about the recognizing both the polarities, the duality, the active and the passive, the masculine and the feminine, the old God and the great mother. They're all represented in this image. The sun, strength, and sight, light itself, are servants of the star and the snake. So within this card, there are some lines and grids, right? There is an edge, there is a structure. You can see that structure. You can see that that circle, right? The continuum. But there's also, you know, the image is blurred behind the maiden dancing. And there is also present within, you know, part of this duality, part of that polarity is the confusion and the mystery and the things that are not known, right? They also are part of this archetype, this symbolism, right? The fixed signs, if you'll notice the fixed signs, I like to go deep into the imagery of the tarot cards. The tarot cards are like the love of my life. I love working with them, but at the four corners of this image, of this card, are the fixed signs. You'll probably notice those, you know, of Aquarius, Taurus, Leo, and Scorpio. So we have the water bearer, the bull, the lion, and the eagle as representative of them. And those fixed signs blow the energy in the four directions, kind of showing and adding to this completion that something is ending, but also something is beginning. And this really represents that fertility that is part of this archetype and this symbol for us. And it also represents the final form, the result of the magical formula of the gods. If you notice the skeleton image at the bottom, this is something I find really fascinating when looking at Saturn and the universe card, is at the base of the image, between the bull and the lion, you'll see kind of like blueprints of a building, right? And these are originally, in this deck, the Thoth deck, the blueprint of the building represents the elements of the periodic table. And at the time of this, and this is significant, at the time that this deck was created in the early 1900s, Crowley was creating this, developing this, there were only 92 known elements. And now there are over 115. And so just that simple fact and that beautiful representation in this card shows us in a very obvious way that kind of transcendence, that things are always changing. Even what we know as to be stable and secure and maybe unchanging or permanent, those things also change, right? We are always transcending. We are always pushing the battle. And with, you know, the other archetypes as well, of course, play into that, like Uranus. Let's see. So there's the wheel of light that initiates the tree of light, which is that circle in the center of the card there. And there are hidden symbols in the matrix arc of stars that kind of wrap around the maiden and the serpent. And so there's so much in this card. And it's a very lively card for what we would think to be associated with the planet Saturn, right? And something that a little mantra that I like to add as well is Ziegler said, that a great mantra for working with this card and working with Saturn is the mantra that I am one with the universe. And it reminds me too of what Carl Sagan said, right? We are star stuff. We're made of star stuff. We are a way for the universe to know itself. And so all of that comes to life with the universe card. And these are a couple of questions that I grabbed from forestastrology.com in relationship to working with Saturn, because I think these are great questions to really ponder, and you can really go deep with if you do any kind of journaling. What is the great work of your life? And you can see how this relates beautifully with the universe card as it represents Saturn. Where do you most need to guard against excesses of caution and hesitancy? With a strong Capricorn signature in myself, I can definitely relate to that. That's one that I'm constantly bringing into my awareness more and more, is that the excess of caution and hesitancy. And with the sun, that's one of the things that I am noticing that has kind of come up for me in my awareness with this transit currently. And what fear unconsciously shapes and limits the scope of your self-expression. And you can see already how those questions bring us right to the sun, right? From an evolutionary perspective, the sun is the principal force of integration. The ruler of the sign of Leo, of course, naturally. The sun is where we creatively actualize our purpose. Meaning and purpose of the current life can be found through the sun, the house, and the sign that it is in, the aspects that it is making, where we find Leo and the fifth house cusp. Children are a natural, essential aspect of the creative potential and purpose of the sun. So here is the sun card. The sun is represented by the sun in the tarot deck. This is card number 19 of the major arcana, signifying consciousness, creative expression. This card is much more simple when compared to a card like the universe. And the only card between the sun, which is the 19 card of the tarot deck, and the universe, which is 21, is 20. It's an eon. The 20 card in the tarot is an eon. And so I find that to be very significant. Always the position and placement of, just like when we are looking at an astrology chart, we look at the placement and the relationship to other planets and signs. I do that with the tarot as well. Known as the Lord of Light, Life, Liberty, and Love, according to Crowley. This image is just a happy image, right? It shows us how we shine our light, but it's a little bit more than that, that we can see with this card, is that it's the fiery flowering rays of sunshine stream out, illuminating all 12 zodiac signs, all of the archetypes. And it really symbolizes freedom, liberation of the human race. And it really kind of shines a light on things like alliances and cosmic, like a communion with the divine, and being at, in partnership with divine source, and kind of channeling that and allowing our light to shine. All of those things as we radiate, just like the sun, right? The sun radiates light that provides nourishment and enables things to grow. And when we think of the sun as well, just as a planet, that's the center of our solar system, right? Everything orbits around the sun. So the sun is a central focus in our lives. So when a planet meets up with our natal sun, that can really have far-reaching effects, right? Especially when it's one of those slower moving planets like Saturn or one of the outer planets. We feel those effects over a period of time. It's not something that just happens like when the moon hits your sun every month, right? It's a much different feeling. The girdle or crown, I kind of see it as a crown. You know, that's a very Leonine theme for the sun. But the crown around that mound at the center of this card, which is kind of the focal point that's getting, you know, basking in the rays of sunshine, that represents kind of a kind of discipline, a boundary, like a limit. There is a need for some kind of control, even with the sun, and that's represented in this card. The youthful twins have butterfly wings, a symbol of creativity and, you know, echoing that theme of freedom and liberation. And it's, I don't know, it's just, I mean, when you look at that image, how can you not be happy? How can you not smile, right? It's one of those things that just kind of exudes confidence. It kind of makes us want to stand up a little bit straighter and feel a little bit of that light expanding and kind of shining through us. And it, to me, it really is more, taps us into that birthright, especially with the children, and the symbols of all of the signs in the zodiac, kind of tapping us into that divine, and that that it really is our birthright. It's in our DNA. We are meant to shine. We all have our unique something, right? Our unique sauce, awesome sauce to bring into this world, and give something back that's make the world a better place, right? And this, and you know, I like this. As I was kind of putting this together, talking about the sun, I also see in this the polarity, right? And you can see this in both cards, the polarity of the sun and Leo. You can see, you know, those Aquarian themes here as well. And again, these are some great questions. I just really love these questions that really kind of get to the core of the archetype. So for the sun individually, when working with it, what are the core principles and soul intentions to which you must be true in order to maintain your sanity, identity, and authenticity? And that really takes us back to that, that girdle or that crown at the top of the mound, like that need for, you know, to maintain your sanity, to really tap into those core drives that you must be true to in order to maintain your vitality and your life force energy. These are themes that really come to life with a Saturn transit, when Saturn meets our sun. So I know I'm speaking to some very wise astrologers here in the community. But these are some just very basic steps to decoding any transit, really. This can be applied to. But for decoding the Saturn Sun transit for yourself, you look to the natal sun, sign placement aspects, and your natal Saturn sign placement aspects, of course, and their relationship to each other, their phasal relationship. Can be very important and help you really go deeper and deepen that awareness of what is occurring in your life and what is unfolding within you. What aspects does the sun make? Because when a planet, in this case Saturn, when Saturn comes to meet your sun, Saturn is also going to be making, of course, naturally, those aspects to the other planets in your chart and making those connections. And because this is a, you know, a natal sun transit, you know, or it's Saturn meeting up with your natal sun, I find it useful. This is something I find useful to bring in the solar return chart. And for me, this is a, maybe a little bit more relevant just because my Saturn transits have happened close to my birthday. So I'm already doing my solar return chart at the beginning of the year with my birthday. And I find it very useful. It kind of adds another layer of things to consider with what's occurring, because as you may know, Saturn doesn't just meet your sun and then it's over. Because of Saturn's cycle, it will retrograde and may pass over your sun 3 times before your transit is complete, right? And you're kind of out of the woods, so to speak. So it, for me personally this year, my exact, you know, the first meetup with Saturn and my natal sun was on February 14th. But I'm going to be feeling these effects throughout the year through to November 2020 due to Saturn's retrograde. And it's been, you know, within orb for a little while now as well. So we always, if you take into consideration the orb, then you have a pretty good chunk of time that you'll be working and evolving through those energies. So now let's get to the greatest. This is, I'm going to share with you an icon from the 20th century, someone that I have had the honor of meeting decades ago that was an inspiration to me. And I just felt compelled to look into his chart and see what his Saturn, I knew his birthday was close to mine. He's born, his birthday was the day after mine on the, my birthday's on January 16th, his is on the 17th. And so I knew our suns were close, but I was really fascinated by him as a child. And, you know, around the time, even before my first Saturn Sun transit, and it's someone I used to watch with my dad, another Saturnian theme. But this man is Muhammad Ali. We're going to talk about his Saturn Sun transit, the 2 that he had during his lifetime. And I found this really interesting because he really embodied the Capricorn archetype in a very unique way, right? Which is very much Saturn Sun, right? It's just bringing to life who you really are, in my opinion, right? If I can see that in his lifetime and in his charts. And I found this quote from him pretty interesting, that I am the greatest. I said that even before I knew I was. So let's take a look. So Muhammad Ali was nicknamed the greatest. He was a heavyweight boxing champion, one of the greatest in his time. And sometimes people don't understand this about me or would never expect this about me, but I used to really love boxing, really love it. As a child, I used to love watching boxing matches with my dad. I believe the sport has changed very much over time, and it's not like it was at all, but that's that's kind of a nostalgia for me, is thinking about watching those boxing matches with my dad. And so Muhammad Ali, he was born Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr., January 17th, 1942, and he died June 3rd, 2016. So in 1961, he had his first Saturn Sun transit. at 19 years old. And that's what I found very fascinating, was putting this timeline together with his chart. He has a fascinating chart, you know, to begin with. It's a fun one to really look at, especially as you consider all that he accomplished in his life. But I wanted to just give an overview and focus on these two Saturn-Sun transits that he experienced in his lifetime. So at 19 years old, he became an Olympic gold medal champion in heavyweight boxing, and he decided to turn pro after that. Before that, he had been kind of an amateur, and he became one of the most well-known boxers in the US. And at around that time as well, he changed his name to Muhammad Ali and converted to Islam. That's a pretty significant shift to make, right, in one's lifetime. And to see it linked up with that Saturn meeting with his son. And like I said, this is a slower moving planet, so it's a kind of a long-term transit. And so this happened in his lifetime over a period of time. It's not that it all happened on that day that Saturn met his son. During his second Saturn transit, Saturn-Sun conjunction, was right around his 49th birthday in 1991. And this, very close to this date, is when I had my first Saturn-Sun transit as well. So this was right around his 49th birthday. And what I find fascinating is, if you're not familiar with his life and what he was most well known for, is that looking at these two charts, you might wonder how this is the same person, because on his second Saturn-Sun transit, he negotiated the release of American hostages with Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And he helped to free 15 American hostages and accompanying them out of the country. And an extra element to this as well, because you always want to look at, you know, a Saturn transit is never happening in a vacuum. It's never isolated. There were obviously many other things going on in his chart, and this one happened to be right around a solar eclipse in the sign of Capricorn. So that kind of gave it that extra oomph for that timing, right? So these are some things that I wanted to share with you about him, because he is such a great example of this kind of transit and the Capricorn archetype. He said that he always wanted to be more than a boxer. And this is very apparent, like he accomplished this as we look at those Saturn-Sun transits for him, right? He wanted to use his fame to uplift and inspire people around the world, and he did just that. Some other interesting things about him were he resisted the draft. He was very against the Vietnam War and resisted the draft, which resulted in his world title being taken from him and his licenses. He wasn't able to box, but it was that important to him. He had that kind of conviction. He was known for his rhymes, which he's the one, if you've ever heard float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, that was him, or rumble in the jungle. And he had all these little rhymes that he was very well known for that. And some I have heard, I'm not sure how accurate this is, and I had difficulty finding out for sure, but some credit him to the early movement of the hip hop movement, because obviously he was boxing before the hip hop movement really took hold in our culture. He had a book named GOAT, Greatest of All Time, a tribute to Muhammad Ali. And the fascinating thing is that that book sold for over $7 grand. It was wrapped in silk. It weighed 75 pounds, and it had, like, it was engraved with Louis Vuitton leather. It was very, very Capricorn. And he also had a company named GOAT, G-O-A-T, greatest of all time, which is something, you know, again, very Capricorn, very Saturn. He was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in the mid-'80s. So at the time that he negotiated the release of those hostages at his second Saturn-Sun transit, he was suffering from Parkinson's disease, which is one of those things. He was always a fighter, which is one of those things that really, I really admired about him as a public figure. I always admired that about him. He was a UN, these are some accomplishments in his lifetime. He was a UN Messenger of Peace, and he was awarded the US Presidential Medal of Freedom. And his celebrity fight nights benefited his Parkinson's Center at the Barrow Neurological Institute, which is one of the most well-known, prestigious institutes, and they do a lot of research on diseases like that. And that is where I actually met him several years ago, was at one of those celebrity fight night charity banquets. And it was really incredible to meet him as a person. So now we're getting a little personal. I do have, you know, with that 8th house sun, I am kind of a private person. I will just kind of preface that. So it actually took a lot of courage for me to share a little bit more of my personal story with you. But I found it so fascinating as I was doing this research and really tuning into the frequency, to the energy of this transit, because it has been coming, you know, Saturn has been in Capricorn for quite some time now, since what, 2018, the end of 2018. And so I felt really drawn to uncovering more of this. Uncovering is a good word for it, right? With the 8th house involved. And for any of you who have questions as well at the end, or even if you're watching the recording or replay, feel free to share any questions, or if you would like some clarification or want to offer some of your experiences with the Saturn-Sun transit, I would love to hear it. So that year, when Muhammad Ali had his second Saturn-Sun transit, I had my first. I was right around my 14th birthday. And there's a look at my chart with my 8th house sun there. There were, of course, at this time, just as you saw with Ali's chart, Neptune and Uranus were also in the sign of Capricorn. So that definitely played into the things that were occurring, the experiences that were taking place, and things that were taking shape at that time, for all of us, right? But they flavored those Saturn-Sun transits for us. But at that time, around my 14th birthday, I too noticed that I had, that was a conviction that I made. I changed my life even at the age of 14. And it's something that I celebrate every year, almost like a, you know, it's something I always remember. I remember it. I've always remembered that long before I really was into astrology and was following these transits and all of this, and really had this kind of understanding. But it was right around that time I became an animal rights activist. This is before it was popular, really. There's a lot more, so much has changed in the last 29 years. But I became a vegetarian, and I grew up in a household and a family that was very, very different. And so but I was very, very passionate about this. And it was started because around that time, that a few months prior, my family had, for Thanksgiving dinner, we had gone to a farm, and my parents thought it would be a good idea to see the turkeys running free. And then we walked into a place and saw them kill the turkey and take the feathers off and wrap it up and send it home with us for our Thanksgiving dinner. And that had such a profound effect on me, that even though I understood and knew on some level at that age that animals were killed and, that's what meat was, I had a completely, it affected me so deeply that I never, ever went back. Like, I never ate meat again, ever. Like, it never changed for me. And that's something that is a strong conviction for me, even to this day. And it started my journey as an animal rights activist. I spent many years being very much, with that Uranus, really helped me with that as well, that Uranus transit. But that year I also had my first poem published, which was a big deal for a 14-year-old. I had submitted a poem to a publisher, and it was part of a compilation from many poets around the country. And something that was quite significant and very eighth house, this is part of, understanding more deeply that eighth house connection and that part of my life, right? And how significant that was. My parents thought it would be like, I was old enough, I was mature enough, which is, whenever you have a Saturn transit, right? There's an element of growing up, of maturing, of reaching a new level in some way. And so my parents thought it would be a good experience for me to be in the room to watch my baby sister be born. And I come from a big family. I have 3 sisters and 2 brothers. This was my youngest of my sisters. And being there and able to witness her birth was a pretty intense experience for me. That was, it showed me a whole new side of life that I had never experienced before in that way, naturally, as a 14-year-old. And so that was a very significant change in my life. And, with the age difference between me and my sister, especially my youngest sister, it was more of a parental relationship, right? I was much older than her. So I cared for her much like she was my own child. I was known for taking her with me everywhere I went. When I got my driver's license, I would just always take my little sisters with me. People often thought I was older than I was at that time, I do remember. They often thought I was already in college when I had just started high school, which is something interesting. Around that time, in 1991, at that age, I also I started my first business. In the summer, I started a daycare with one of my best friends, that very Saturn, or very sun, right? My son really came alive with that. I really enjoyed that. We made little business cards and everything. And, it was very organized. I remember that. It was a lot of fun because we wanted to make our own money. That was kind of like my first job, really, was having my own daycare with my good friend who lived across the street. That year, I had grown up taking piano lessons. I had taken piano lessons at that time, I believe, for about 7 years. And it was that year that I had a new piano teacher who allowed me to compose and encouraged me even to compose my own music, to play songs that I liked instead of just the classical, the Beethoven, Tchaikovsky, all of that very traditional stuff. I was given the opportunity to choose my own songs that I wanted to play that were more modern and compose my own music. And I actually wrote a song and presented it at a recital that year. And another significant thing, reflecting back on that time, was that I was raised in a very religious household. And it was, and I had up until that point, which is not uncommon for these kinds of transits, you know, was I suddenly realized that that wasn't the religion for me. I started breaking away from that. I started feeling very restricted and bound by that, especially as I was starting high school. As part of that age in life too, as well, and nearing my Saturn opposition as well. When Saturn enters Aquarius, I have my Saturn opposition. So this Saturn meeting the sun kind of triggered that separation for me from the religion that I was raised in. And I had been a straight A student up until that point. I was always the teacher's pet, always had straight A's. And then that year, my first year of high school, I started, actually failed my first class because I fell asleep. I just was uninterested. I started skipping school. I started, not wanting to go to church, not wanting to be involved with the religious practices that my family had, that I had been growing up in. And so I started really becoming more of myself. I started aligning more with who I was versus who I was taught to be. And I find that very Saturn Sun conjunct, very strong influence in that. So now it's February of 2020, and I'm having this Saturn Sun transit again. And it's still unfolding. I'm 43 years old, or as I like to say, I'm like a fine wine. I get better with age. I think we all do, right? And Pluto is very close to this transit, right? Pluto is about to meet my sun in a couple years. It's slower moving planet, of course, right? So I'm still kind of deepening into this understanding. When Saturn hit, came close to my sun this month, I decided to take a spa day, which is very unlike me. That's the picture right there. Which takes a lot of courage for me to even share like a selfie picture. And it's very, not so much like me, but I was really, I felt it was very important to really take care of my body. I did like the whole thing, the body wrap, the massage, everything. And I took the day to really celebrate myself and this physical body and really take supreme care of myself. And that's how I wanted to intentionally begin this transit, this stage in my life, because this is a transit that only happens every, 28 to 30 years, right? Around 29 years with Saturn's movements. And so I wanted to really tune into it, and I felt a spa day was in order. And I wanted to just share with you some of the insights that are kind of being unfolding for me. Unfolding is a really good word because I know I'm just at the beginning of this transit this time around. So that's what I'm gonna do. So as we do, we observe and correlate. So what I've been observing in myself as of late are themes like, I had to use this image with the flowers because it's become very important for me to do the little things that bring me joy. And this to me is that Saturn meeting with my son, right? And one of those things that brings me joy is having fresh flowers in my home. And I love to garden, but I live in upstate New York, so it is a very cold climate this time of year for us. And so I every week I go and I buy fresh flowers to have inside my home. And that is very symbolic and significant. It changes the environment that is with me. It's very intentional. It's something that is kind of like become a staple for me. And this is something that, in the past, years in the past, I would have considered that to be kind of superfluous, unimportant. Like I wouldn't want to waste the money on something like that. So I'm noticing that little subtle changes like that, right? A couple of other things that I'm starting to notice that are kind of emerging within me are, I feel this need to kind of conserve energy. That's part of what that spa day was for me as I started the Saturn Sun transit, is that there are some things I simply are not worth my energy. And so I kind of protect my energy, my life force energy, so that I can give my all to the things that matter to me, to the things that I love, to the things that I'm in it for the long haul, right? Those things that we all have those things, those things that we value very deeply. So the power of no has become very important. I'm working more. I find that I've taken on more responsibilities, and I work usually 7 days a week, but I have plenty of energy for that because I've learned to a greater extent this power of no. And that is part of that Pluto coming in, right? That Pluto's influence, the filtering within the Saturnian influence. I feel compelled to take on responsibilities, but I also am more highly aware of my responsibility to take care of myself. And the reason for that is so that I can do the things that are important and accomplish the things that are important, right? And so in order to accomplish what is most meaningful, I realized that I cannot do it all. And so I'm very selective in what I take on. I can take on a lot more when I'm selective in this way, is what I'm realizing too. And it does feel like a next level realizing, like even just a couple of years ago, I don't think I had this kind of awareness. Also, no more excuses, and apologies come into this as well. And I don't mean this to be, there's never a need to apologize, because most certainly there is. We all may make mistakes. But what I'm realizing more and more is and I'm intentionally noticing, it's just kind of come into my awareness, where how I use my language. When I make an excuse for something, it's usually, things like, I didn't have enough time. That's very Saturn, right? Or it's just too tired. With a Saturn meeting our sun, our energy levels can, that's one of those kind of blanket things that you see if you do a little surface reading online of what a Saturn Sun transit might be like. One of the first things is, low energy, because Saturn is meeting the sun. But really, to me, it's more of a conservation of energy. And so noticing where I make excuses and what those excuses are really tune me into, I get really curious about it. With the Gemini rising, right? And I do want to make note too with my, you may have noticed with my natal chart, I have a mutual reception with the Sun and Saturn. So my Sun is in Capricorn, Saturn is in Leo, and Leo is my third house, right? And I have Gemini rising. So everything really is integrating and connecting. I'm starting to see how all of these different things come into play. So I'm noticing the excuses I make. And I notice when I apologize for things that are not worthy of an apology, right? That kind of passiveness or just wanting to appease people. And I feel like that is a waste of my energy. I'd much rather be more intentional. So instead of apologizing for if something doesn't go right and something runs late or something like that, I say thank you for your patience, or thank you for understanding, or thank you. I kind of am doing my best to reframe things with my language, because the language we use is so important in shaping our reality, right? I know we're about out of time, but I wanted to just bring up these last couple of things. Another question I've really been honing, and this started really for me with when Saturn entered Capricorn. This has been an ongoing thing, but it becomes more like a living daily mantra. It's something that it's a non-negotiable for me every day. I consider this, what am I willing to live with? And that one question really guides my choices throughout the day. Of course, not every moment of every day, right? But I really tuning into that, it really shapes what am I going to what am I going to regret not doing? What am I going to resent if I do it? I know myself well enough at the age of 43 that I'm familiar with those things that will keep me up at night, right? If I don't do them, or the things that I may get caught up in that really feel like a waste of time. My time has become a very precious commodity, and I want to use it wisely. And so that question tunes me into that, reminds me that I'm mortal, but I'm also immortal. It's that to me is the essence of the Capricorn archetype. Saturn, and with this, the Sun being involved with this transit, it really helps us integrate, helping me integrate those. It's the both and, right? They are both true. We are mortal and immortal spirits, right? But we are in these mortal bodies. So both are important to recognize, to take care of, to consider, right? And being aware of, what I'm willing to live with is, being aware that, if I die tomorrow, would I feel satisfied? Would I feel like I gave it my all? Will I feel like I lived on purpose, that I was embodying love, best of my ability? And finally, keeping promises. And that starts with myself, right? The promises we keep to ourselves are first and foremost, because if we can't keep promises to ourselves, then we naturally can't keep promises to anyone else. And that's one of those things that's become more important to me. And it's helping me as well finish up business, tackle that unfinished business that is really integral and a great way to work with this kind of a transit with Saturn in any capacity, really, but really honoring my promises to myself and to others helps me, keeping that in mind, keeping that as part of helps me embrace who I am that I want to be a person of integrity, right? And so how do I live that out? How do I honor that? And it starts from within, and that works with the polarity of Capricorn and Cancer, right? The sun and the moon. It's that honoring, taking care of ourselves, and how that naturally helps us take care of others, how it naturally helps us shape our external reality and the experience of this lifetime. So thank you so much for joining me today. I wanted to wrap it up with this, quick overview of the 2020 timeline for Saturn. These are just some key dates. And I also want to remind you too, if you have not checked out, there are so many amazing speakers that have presented on the topic of Saturn, not just for, these transits for this year, but just, working constructively with Saturn, with Ari, to Tara's, I am Saturn, the living archetype. There are so many great videos to watch, so many speakers that have so much to offer on a deeper understanding of the Saturn archetype, that I highly recommend it if you have not checked those out. And here are a couple of articles I also recommend that I found really interesting, especially that one from Fugitive Umbrellas. That's a fun one. The author of that article has a great sense of humor, which I find very refreshing for a Saturn transit. It's growing up and other gifts you want to return for cash. It's all about that Saturn transit. So Saturn meeting the Sun transit. So thank you so much for joining me and listening and tuning in. You can find me if you'd like to stay in touch. I would love to stay in touch with you. You can find me on the social medias at Eclipse Tarot and on the web at eclipsetarot.com. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I'm pretty active on Messenger as well, on Facebook and Instagram. And just thank you so much for being a part of my journey in this lifetime.
Great. Thank you so much, Kimberly. We look forward to seeing you on March the 5th for the Aries archetype in the tarot. So looking forward to that. Thank you.
Fabulous.
From all of us, and we'll see you later.
Bye. Thank you, Linda.
Thank you.